Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I was going to address the dignitaries, but they've left the room. It's just a huge pleasure to be back here in Hong Kong with friends and colleagues that I've known now for several years. It's just one of my favorite things, that the civility, the energy, and so on that you pick up when you're here is refreshing in view of what's going on in the rest of the world. My topic is making sense of global disorder. My first reaction to that was to ask the organizers to change the title to Making Sense of Global Nonsense. And there's an element of truth in that, but then I thought to myself that trivializes in a not very productive way what are probably some pretty deep and challenging problems that we face. But forgive me, if I put on my economics hat for a moment, you might ask yourself, what disorder? I mean, after all, we have the first synchronized growth acceleration globally in 10 years, since before the crisis. The US is doing reasonably well. Markets are, humming along cheerfully, elevated, even a little bit bubbly. The European economies are still struggling a bit, but doing better. China is moving along really quite nicely, powered by a growing young middle class, rising consumption, a startling amount of innovation, and a modern digitally enabled system of commerce, mobile payments, and credit, and a lot more. And India is doing really very well with a sustained growth pattern, elevated above 7%. And even Latin America, which has had some fairly difficult times in the last few years, seems to be turning a corner. And growth, again with bumps along the road in Africa, is doing reasonably well. So you might ask yourself the question, what is it exactly we're worried about? And so far, markets, bellwethers of, what might go wrong, at least in the minds of some people, have shown a remarkable ability to shrug off a whole lot of things. Brexit, a weakened Chancellor Merkel and Prime Minister May in the middle of the Brexit negotiations, anti-establishment political patterns on a broad front in the West, an unusual number of very strong hurricanes and typhoons in both the Atlantic and the Pacific, Mr. Trump, President Trump, America first, governing by tweet, exiting from the TPP, NAFTA in its current form, the Paris Climate Agreement, and I think by mutual consent, the TTIP, is the treaty with Europe, focused on both trade and investment, is essentially been put on hold, to put it politely. So maybe markets really are immune to all this political and social turmoil that we're seeing, and this is a tale of sound and fury signifying nothing, or maybe not. So let me do two things, and I'll try to be relatively brief. One is to focus on the economic dimensions of this, and then to shift gears and focus on something that's a little harder to describe, but I think in some sense is deeper and more important. So let me talk briefly about the growth pattern since World War II. For roughly the first 35 years after World War II, the growth patterns in the global economy were benign. War recovery occurred, the developed economies grew well, and with starts and stops, the developing world started to grow for the first time. It was a massive exercise in inclusiveness. And if you look inside countries, the indices of income and wealth inequality were declining rather than rising. The middle class was growing, and so on. So there wasn't really much to complain about, and you didn't hear much complaining. But those patterns reversed in the late 1970s and early 1980s for reasons that are still being debated, and we don't have anywhere near enough time to delve into it. But they did reverse, and they have moved in the opposite direction. Income as a share of labor income as a share of national income has been declining. Gini coefficients and other measures of income and wealth inequality have been rising. And I think probably the best single way to understand it is that what have come to be called job and income polarization, which means the expansion of the outer ends of the tail of the income and wealth distribution and the decline in the middle is real and it's pervasive. Now, if you go across countries, you find that the impact is different because of differential vigor in Social Security and social service systems and income redistribution programs, but nobody has been immune from this. And these patterns appear to have spilled over into political and social polarization and a broad and expanding rejection of the status quo. Or to put it slightly more bluntly, people are angry, they're anxious, and they're insecure. I believe all of this is not the whole explanation, but certainly a contributing factor to what I sometimes call the centrifugal forces that are operating in the global economy, both within countries and in the global economy. So the natural question is, why and why now? And I think there's a simple answer to that. It's a combination of these growth patterns that I just described, drifting in the wrong direction and then accelerating in the wrong direction around the year 2000, combined with either feeble or negligible responses on the part of governing structures. And they're both important. It's the anger comes from the fact that the patterns were ignored for a long period of time. And this is a cautionary, I think, for all of us, including in this room today. It's not going to help to talk about it if nothing happens, right? It's crucial that we end up in a situation where there's some vigorous attempt over time to reverse these growth patterns. So I think it's that combination that has helped put us in this situation. Well, what does this rejection of the system mean? Well, it means rejection of established political parties, elites, in business, in finance, in my field, in economics and in academia. Why? Because we didn't see the crisis coming, because we oversold globalization. We didn't discuss the difficult transitions that economies go through structurally and in terms of jobs with anywhere near enough clarity to help guide policy and so on. And in the course of this, I think, and this may be the most important thing I say, at least on this front, is that in the course of this we lost something that's intangible but important. And that is what the Europeans call social and political cohesion. Other people have different names for it. That cohesion, in my view, is based on a shared commitment to the primacy of the public interest, which is another way of saying to inclusive growth patterns. And in its shortest version, I think we've lost trust in the institutions, in the governing elites, and so on. Now, rejection of the system, which is what we're seeing now with growing vigor, doesn't mean that what replaces it is necessarily better. So there's a real risk, I think, that we'll be in for a period of political paralysis, policy inconsistency, maybe some very poor choices with respect to how to proceed. This is a complete aside, but in my view, China potentially had a problem that's not dissimilar in the period after 2000. Because notwithstanding the superb economic performance, there was a growing batch of commentary about loss of reform momentum. And to the credit of the current administration and President Xi Jinping, the anti-corruption campaign and the reestablishment of the moral authority of the party, I think, has righted that ship. In some ways, although we live in very different systems, something similar to that is sort of needed on a much broader front. Now let me shift gears and close. At a much deeper level, I think there are inherent tensions in the concept of globalization and the way our societies are evolving. People have needs and desires and fears with respect to a wide range of things. I wrote down a list just as an illustration. They care about growth and productivity and incomes, to be sure, but they care about equity and fairness, inclusiveness, opportunity, sustainability, stability, culture, identity, sovereignty, security, governance, self-determination. And all of those things have surfaced in the discussions that we hear about. So this isn't just an economic phenomenon. If you think about those basic impulses of human beings for a minute, you'll discover there's inherent tensions in trying to achieve all those things. Some of them point in the direction of localism and away from, remote, powerful forces and governance structures. Some of them point in the opposite direction. And so I think, in some sense, at a deeper level, that's kind of where our challenge lies. Dr. Fred Hu and I wrote an article this summer, it's in Foreign Affairs, on globalization. And if you think of globalization as defined by flows, relatively free flows of goods and services, capital, people, technology, information, data, and so on, those four, then it's not difficult to see that all four are under some kind of assault now. People are resisting on every front. For example, the old notion that the internet was a big, wonderful, open system that most of us believed 15 years ago, I think that's just gone. I mean, the cybersecurity issues in multiple dimensions are simply too big to ignore. And similarly, we don't need to go through the list. I think the simple truth is that globalization in its simple and somewhat naive form, which worked for a while, has lost its capacity to meet this broad set of needs of people. And we have before us an exercise in creativity in rebuilding kind of governance structures and rules and procedures and so on in such a way that it does a better job to meet those needs. Last comment. Notwithstanding this, there are huge benefits from international cooperation. I'm going to use that term rather than globalization. And there are even larger costs of failing to cooperate in areas where we absolutely have to, such as climate change. So the commitment to some form of multilateralism is important and reassuringly is very broad-based in the world. In Europe, notwithstanding the need to restructure and reform those, especially the Eurozone structure. It's even broadly based in the United States. You can see in climate change, basically cities, states, and a whole lot of other people are simply going their own way and staying with the climate agreements. So what's this all about? I think it's largely about governance structures, domestic and international, that are struggling to keep up with people's needs. And that's my main message for this morning. I believe in the course of today, we will hear a lot of interesting and important ideas and thoughts on these subjects, and I'm really looking forward to hearing them. But I think in my view, if I had to summarize it, is there is rising systemic risk in the system. It is not showing up in economies and markets yet, but I don't believe for a minute that you can go on this way forever. Probably what we're going to need is some version of responsible nationalism built on restoring trust and inclusive growth patterns, combined with a focused attempt to approach international cooperation in the areas that we really need it, if I had to, put it in one sentence. Oh, yes. Suman.
Just to ask whether this anomie you think is as pronounced in the poor world as in the rich world.
Suman, I didn't hear the question. So.
Just to ask if this loss of trust is as pronounced in the poor world as the rich world.
Probably not. I mean, if things had gone badly in China and the party had lost its credibility, if the reform momentum lull that you know very well in India had persisted then I think there would have been a much broader, loss of trust. It's a kind of mixed picture. I mean, I do think in Brazil, a wide range of citizens feel betrayed by the government and the high level of corruption that has appeared in the last few years. So it's a little hard to say. But on a systematic basis, I think the problems that I have tried to describe are more severe at this point in the developed economies for understandable reasons. For example, the same market and digital technological forces that are operating everywhere, but my sense is in China and in India, the net benefits of the growth patterns are significantly positive. It's not that, automation and other things aren't stripping routine jobs out of every economy, but they're also generating a huge amount of growth momentum in these economies. And so I think it's understandable that at this stage of growth, the developing economies are experiencing more benign impacts. Having said that, the early stage developing countries are at risk of being cut off by the digital technologies for the obvious reason that if digital technologies continue on this trajectory, they're going to surpass labor-intensive, process-oriented manufacturing, and that is the known growth model at the early stages of development. So for that, we don't really have answers. Yes, I mean.
Michael, in summary, could one not argue that everything in the end revolves around the whole employment issue?
It revolves around?
Employment,
Yeah,
creating
I agree.
employment for people.
Yeah.
Different countries can tackle it in different ways, and thinking about our own problems in a developing country like the Philippines, my country, I sometimes think that there will be a role for governments to slow down the productivity curve to allow employment to reach as full capacity as possible. Is this whole employment issue and the tensions that arise from it, the lack of employment opportunities and the like, really the crux of it all, or do you see other elements aside from that? Because in the end, when I listen to your words and listen to others' words, I think it all boils down to that. Immigration affects employment, productivity affects employment, technology affects employment. It's all in the end about people getting jobs. Is that a proper way to read it?
Well, it's certainly, I think, a centrally important, theme. So I completely agree with you that the core, at least on the economic side, is employment. I think the resistance to immigration is broader than that. There's a question of cultural identity. When the tsunami of immigrants hits, as it has in Europe, that makes people extremely uncomfortable. So I think it's slightly broader than that. I'm not sure, however, that slowing down productivity growth is the way to think about this. I think of big, rapid shocks delivered either via globalization or technology as producing extended periods of transitions that are difficult. And the best way to think of it is not as a permanent condition, but a challenge in terms of helping people and get through it. Mostly, this time may be different. We may actually run out of jobs as opposed to just having difficulty making the human capital catch up with the demand side of the labor market. But in the past, at least, technology has not killed employment eventually. It has killed certain kinds of jobs. And so with that as background, I think that's the reason for thinking that the problem is managing very hard transitions for economies, for people, for everything. There are things that economies do that are highly dysfunctional. I mean, I live in a country, Italy, whose GDP is way below what it was in 2007. That doesn't help. It has structural rigidities that mean that the kind of growth that produces some kind of momentum in terms of generating new employment is much lower there than it does in other places. So I'd probably go the opposite direction. I wouldn't kick the growth and productivity and income agenda out, but recognize that it's only part of the story. Thank you all very much.